I'm honored to introduce our speaker for this evening, someone who has been a longtime member of this community, was raised here at Beth Emmet, raised his children at Beth Emmet, and is still with us and always willing to share not only his wisdom, but his Menschlichkeit. Kalman Resnick is a partner with Hughes' so-called peers, Resnick and Dim, and he's had more than 40 years of experience as an immigration law practitioner. 51. I'm reading from your bio and it says more than 40. I guess we're going to have to update that here. And has vast knowledge of a multiplicity of immigration practice areas, contributes to his ability to counsel and advocate for his clients in the field of immigration law. In addition to immigration law, Kalman practices in the areas of labor and employment law, civil rights, and constitutional law. He has practiced law since 1973. He has extensive experience in virtually every area of immigration practice, including business immigration, family unification, asylum and refugee matters, nationality and citizenship issues, employer sanctions and other employment-related immigration matters, and the defense of foreign nationals under removal proceedings. That may come up tonight, huh? Mr. Resnick has decades of experience representing clients in the fields of labor and employment law, and he has extensive experience in collective bargaining, negotiations, labor arbitration, wage and hour matters, and the litigation of labor and employment matters. Upon graduation from law school in 1973, Mr. Resnick received a Reginald Heber Smith Fellowship to work at the 18th Street Neighborhood Legal Services Office of the Legal Assistance Foundation of Chicago, and in 1976 he obtained private foundation funding to open the Legal Services Center for Immigrants, one of the nation's first legal services advocacy centers for immigrant rights. And there are many, many other accomplishments that Kalman has. And he is speaking this evening on loving our neighbors and the strangers in our midst in a time of xenophobia and fear. Since the election, Kalman got in touch with me and said that he had an opportunity to speak at Mishkan, one of the congregations in the city where Rabbi Lizzie Heidemann is a rabbi, and would I be interested in having him speak on this issue? And I said, of course, everybody is interested in this topic. Everybody wants to know what we can do to protect immigrants within our midst and those who are less fortunate. I think many of us have been very nervous about how we've seen the trampling of rights of so many, and so to have somebody who can come and speak with your expertise and give us the knowledge that we need and the motivation and the hope and perhaps some direction about what we can do to make sure that we can live the value of loving our neighbor as ourselves and protecting the stranger within our midst, all values we find within our tradition. Besides being an expert in these areas, those of you who haven't had the privilege of knowing Kalman, he is also a tremendous mensch. He does this work because he cares deeply about human beings, and he is curious and interested about people who come from all over the world, and he extends his hand and his heart freely to them. And he has been a friend and a mentor to me in all my years here at Beth Emmet, and I'm so delighted that he's here to speak with us tonight.
Shabbat Shalom.
I'm going to give you a microphone, though, here.
For those who might not know of my history with the synagogue, although you just heard it, I've been a member of Beth Emmet since 1956, when my family moved from Chicago to Evanston. I was 8 years old. This synagogue and its rabbis, including my dear friend, Rabbi London, and my experiences in the Evanston civil rights struggles of the 1960s have been critical to the development of my social justice activism and my moral compass. I have been an immigrant rights lawyer for the past 51 years, and I will speak tonight about the Trump administration's attack on immigrant families and immigrant communities, and why Beth Emmet and this community should be an active participant in their defense. At the same time, I want to acknowledge our need to participate in the struggles of all who are vulnerable to the Trump administration's constant attacks, including African Americans, the LGBTQ community, women, Native Americans, Muslim Americans, federal employees, universities, and so many others. I want to dedicate my Devar Torah to my mother's first cousin, Fanny Finger, her husband, Albert Levy, and their son. In June 1940, The Nazis occupied Paris, the city where Fanny and Albert were born and were residing as French citizens. In September 1940, Fanny and Albert complied with a Nazi edict requiring all Jews to register with the police. On October 6, 1942, Fanny, Albert, and their 2-year-old son were arrested by the Nazi authorities and their French fascist collaborators and detained at the Drancy internment camp outside Paris. On February 13, 1943, Fanny, Albert, and their son were transported on a French train to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland, where they were murdered in its gas chambers. Here's the wedding photograph of Fanny and Albert. And here's a letter from the French government certifying what happened to my cousin. Fanny is alive in me every time I see a client, every time I go to immigration court to defend a client, and tonight as I offer this Devar Torah. The book of Exodus, which we continue reading this Shabbat, instructs us regarding our obligations to the strangers among us. Chapter 22, verse 20 of Exodus commands, "You shall not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Indeed, no less than 36 times our Torah mandates that we protect the strangers in our midst. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34 gets right to the point. "The strangers who reside with you shall be to you as your citizens, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Pope Francis referenced the book of Exodus in his February 10, 2025 letter to U.S. bishops, asking American Catholics to defend immigrants in our nation. The story of our Exodus has resonated through my life. As a young child, I saw the parallels between our Exodus from Egypt and the mass departure of Jews from Eastern Europe between 1880 and World War I. During this period, millions of Jews emigrated from Eastern Europe to the United States, Canada, Latin America, and Western Europe, seeking safety from the perils of anti-Semitism. The difficulties my own family faced in this journey highlight the fierce opposition to the immigration of Jews to the United States. In 1911, my maternal grandmother, Molly, a 17-year-old orphan, and her 12-year-old sister, Rose, were denied entry to the United States at Ellis Island because of their brother-in-law's leadership in the garment workers' strike of 1910 that led to the formation of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. In 1927, my 8-year-old mother and her parents and 4 Canadian-born siblings, together with my Aunt Eileen, who was a U.S. citizen because of her birth while the family was in Chicago, were deported back to Canada for having entered the United States illegally. Restrictive immigration quotas enacted by a Republican-majority Congress after World War I barred them from immigrating lawfully to the United States. These same restrictive quotas prevented millions of Jews in Europe from finding safety in the United States before and during the Holocaust, condemning members of my family and many of yours to death in the ghettos and concentration camps of Nazi-occupied Europe. As a student at Evanston Township High School in the 1960s, I saw the parallels between our exodus from Egypt, from Egyptian slavery, and the migration to Evanston of the families of my African-American classmates fleeing Jim Crow segregation in the South. The stories told me by my classmates and their parents, including the lynching on October 21, 1916 in Abbeville, South Carolina, of Anthony Crawford, the great-grandfather of my classmate and close friend, Colette Hill, motivated me to join the NAACP Youth Council in high school in 1962 and fight for racial justice in Evanston, Chicago, and the South. In the 1970s, as a young legal services lawyer in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, I saw the parallels between our history and the exodus of Mexicans, Central Americans, and Caribbean Americans fleeing poverty and political oppression and violence in the hope of finding safety and prosperity in the United States. For the past 51 years, I've used my skills as a lawyer to defend the rights of immigrants and their communities. There have been significant victories, including the enactment of the Refugee Act of 1980, which reformed our asylum system to comply with the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, the enactment in 1986 of a legalization program that put almost 3 million people on a pathway to permanent residence and U.S. citizenship, and the creation by President Obama of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, known by the acronym DACA, in 2012, to stop the deportation of children brought to the U.S. while under age 16. There have also been many defeats. However, in all the years I have practiced immigration law, there has been no time as frightening as the past 53 days for immigrant families and as challenging for those of us committed to defending immigrants. I am here tonight to sound the alarm about what is contained in the 11 executive orders Trump signed on January 20th pertaining to immigrant families, and the many other actions taken by his administration since the inauguration to advance his agenda of mass deportation, strict limits on legal immigration, and the end of our history as a nation that welcomes refugees and asylees. Let me summarize the most distressing. Number one, to accomplish mass deportations, the Protecting the American People from Invasion executive order requires most undocumented people to register and be fingerprinted so that removal action can be taken against them. 2 days ago, that's this past Wednesday, the Department of Homeland Security promulgated regulations to require non-citizens who enter the United States without authorization to register as the first step towards their expulsion. The regulations, which go into effect on April 11th, subject immigrants who fail to register to criminal and civil penalties. Undocumented immigrants are facing very cruel choices: register and face deportation, not register and face prosecution, or depart the United States with all the hardships of separation from U.S. citizen and lawful permanent resident family members. Number two, issuance of a U.S. Department of Justice memorandum threatening to prosecute the elected leaders of sanctuary cities, counties, and states if they fail to cooperate with Trump's plans for mass deportation. The Trump administration has filed a lawsuit to require Chicago, Cook County, and the state of Illinois to stop enforcing their sanctuary laws and ordinances, and is threatening to discontinue federal funding to these very units of government and to close many federal offices in our state. Number three, subjecting immigrants who cannot prove to an arresting ICE officer, Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer, that they have been in the U.S. for at least 2 years to immediate deportation through a process known as expedited removal, with no right to be released on bond or defend themselves before an immigration judge. This makes the arresting ICE officer a policeman, the prosecutor, and the judge. Throughout our nation and here in Illinois, ICE is using expedited removal to deport non-citizens who cannot prove they have been in the United States for at least 2 years, and denying them the right to be released from detention on bond or personal recognizance, and the right to a due process removal hearing at which they can dispute their deportability and apply for asylum, withholding of removal, or other forms of relief. Number four, under the Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship executive order, ending birthright citizenship for children who do not have at least one parent who is a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident despite the guarantees of the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution that all children born in the United States are citizens of the United States. Even though every federal district court to consider this executive order has held it to be blatantly unconstitutional, the Trump administration is seeking permission from the U.S. Supreme Court right now to implement the ban on birthright citizenship outside these judicial districts, while they continue to fight to end it everywhere. With a 6-3 right-wing majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, there is no guarantee that birthright citizenship will be upheld by the Supreme Court. Number 5, denying migrants at our southern border the right to apply for asylum based on their fear of persecution and destroying the ideological neutrality of our asylum system. One example of the takeover of our asylum system by these right-wing ideologues is the instruction this week to all USCIS asylum officers not to use the word transgender and not to grant asylum based on transgender persecution. Number 6, suspending the admission of refugees to the United States while Trump decides how refugee admissions can be limited to just those refugees who he determines will be able to assimilate into the United States. Although a federal court in Seattle has ordered the Trump administration to resume refugee admissions, the administration is resisting the order. In addition, Trump has announced his desire to only admit refugees like white South African Afrikaners, whose admission meets his white supremacist views. Number 7, denying employment authorization to immigrants while they have pending applications for asylum, lawful permanent residence, or protection as crime victims or victims of trafficking. Without employment authorization, immigrant families will have no way to support themselves while applying for legal status. Number 8, and there's 17 of these, and I hate to burden you with them, but you need to hear this. You need to know what's happening in our country. Number 8, removing the bar to ICE officers conducting enforcement operations in schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, healthcare institutions, and the courts. As a result, immigrants fear sending their children to school, attending religious services, seeking health care, or reporting crimes to law enforcement, and are disappearing from these formerly protected venues. Number 9, reopening immigrant family detention facilities and resuming the detention of immigrant children. Just this week, the Department of Homeland Security announced the reopening of the family detention centers in Dilley and Karnes, Texas, where many of the worst abuses of immigrant families occurred during the first Trump administration. Number 10, conducting a reevaluation of the temporary protected status designations of the 17 countries granted that designation by Biden and prior administrations to protect people in the United States from those countries from violent conflict or climate-related or other catastrophes in those countries. The aim of the administration is to deport hundreds of thousands of those living in our country with TPS protection. Already, Department of Homeland Security has announced the end of TPS for many Venezuelans and is terminating TPS for Haitians as of August 31, 2025. The TPS terminations are being challenged by immigrant advocacy groups in the federal courts. Those facing the loss of TPS status include more than 344,000 Venezuelans, 200,000 Haitians, 180,000 Salvadorians, 54,000 Hondurans, and 50,000 Ukrainians. Number 11, ending the humanitarian parole status of hundreds of thousands of citizens of Venezuela, Ukraine, Haiti, and Nicaragua, who as a result of that action will be forced to leave our country. In addition, the Trump administration is trying to deny these humanitarian parolees the right to apply for lawful permanent resident status even when they marry U.S. citizens or have U.S. citizen children. Number 12, the Trump administration is expected to announce this month a new Muslim ban, barring citizens from select Muslim-majority countries from the United States, and has already introduced new vetting requirements that are delaying, often indefinitely, the adjudication of the visa applications of Muslims, separating thousands of Muslim families. Number 13, deporting citizens who can't be deported to their home countries or are stateless to third countries like Panama, which are being strong-armed by Trump to accept these deportees. Number 14, threatening to deport international students and lawful permanent residents for exercising their First Amendment right to participate in protests and to speak to the media about their views. This week we have the case of Mahmoud Khalil, a lawful permanent resident married to a U.S. citizen who the Trump administration has detained and is trying to deport on account of his participation at protests at Columbia University over Israel's war on the people of Gaza, and based on the Secretary of State's determination that his presence or activities in the U.S. may have serious adverse policy consequences for the U.S. This is an actual statute that was passed during the McCarthy era. It says he can be deported because his activities or presence may have serious adverse policy consequences for U.S. foreign policy. A second Columbia student protester, Lekwa Korda, a West Bank Palestinian, was arrested in New York by ICE today. We must defend Khalil and Lekwa and the First Amendment, or we will lose our own freedoms under the First Amendment. Number 15, terrorizing immigrant neighborhoods with raids by ICE officers who, without judicial warrants, question residents solely based on their appearance and are detaining and deporting hundreds of undocumented immigrants each week, separating them from their U.S. citizen and permanent resident spouses, children, and grandparents. Number 16, criminalizing immigrants by prosecuting them for crimes such as past illegal entries or in the future, failure to register. And this week in Los Angeles, a family that is here with permission under the Temporary Protected Status Program and has applied for asylum was charged with illegal entry when they came to the U.S. 2 years ago. Number 17, seeking to end the DACA program and deport more than 530,000 DACA recipients who have lived in the United States with DACA protection since 2012. The Trump administration is expected to announce the end of DACA within weeks, and the Republican attorney generals, with the support of the Trump administration, will be arguing in the U.S. Supreme Court later this year for a ruling that the DACA program is illegal. Carlos, would you stand up? Our good friend Carlos Miyasato, who came to the United States in 5th grade from Peru and is a graduate of Washington School, Nichols Junior High, and ETHS, is here tonight. Carlos has a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago and a master's degree from Arizona State University in special education with an emphasis on autism. He is a board-certified behavioral analyst who treats autistic children. He is one of the DACAs who have no way to remain in our country if DACA is ended. Carlos, thank you for being here tonight. How has Trump and his xenophobic team of immigrant haters been able to create such an agenda for mass deportation? The answer is their success in villainizing immigrants through lies and falsehoods that have no basis in fact. First, they have tried to convince us that the undocumented are here because they simply refused to follow legal pathways to immigration. The reality is that over the past 57 years, Congress has changed our immigration laws to make it virtually impossible for undocumented people to legally immigrate. These changes in our immigration law include the enactment of restrictive numerical limitations and punitive statutory bars that prevent the undocumented from becoming lawful permanent residents, even when they are married to U.S. citizens or have U.S. citizen children, parents, or siblings. As a practical matter, you can say Congress created our undocumented population. And some of you may not know that before July 1, 1968, there was no limit on how many people could immigrate to the United States from the Western Hemisphere. No limit. We created the limit at this very moment when we were needing and wanting more immigrant labor. To give you a sense of how challenging legal immigration is, preference immigrants from Mexico are subject to an annual limitation of 25,620, which makes the wait to immigrate for family-based immigrants from Mexico up to 25 years. These bars to legal immigration are the reason why most undocumented people cannot lawfully immigrate, and even though most of the undocumented live in mixed status families with U.S. citizens, spouses, children, parents, grandparents, and siblings. Second, they try to convince us that immigrants are criminals. However, crime statistics demonstrate that immigrants commit far fewer crimes than U.S. citizens. Moreover, strict immigration laws already bar immigrants with significant criminal convictions. Third, they try to convince us that immigrants are taking the jobs of U.S. citizens. However, most states have a significant shortage of workers, and most U.S. citizens do not want the jobs performed by immigrants. Let's be honest. How many of us employ or have employed undocumented people to care for our children, our parents, or our homes, or to work in our places of business? Don't we all patronize restaurants and other businesses where we enjoy the services of the undocumented? Fourth, they try to convince us that immigrants are a burden on our social welfare system. That is false. Undocumented immigrants are barred from almost all government benefits. In conclusion, I want to urge the Beth Emmet community and the Evanston congregations whose leaders are here tonight to join the resistance to the attacks upon immigrant families I have outlined tonight. I offer my expertise to help you figure out how best Beth Emmet and Evanston can participate in the defense of our immigrant neighbors. At least twice before, Beth Emmet has taken up the challenge of defending immigrant families. During the 1980s, under Rabbi Noble's leadership, the Beth Emmet Board of Directors voted for Beth Emmet to become a sanctuary for two undocumented indigenous families who fled Guatemala during the Civil War. For several years, we provided housing, food, employment, and legal services to these families who ultimately were granted lawful permanent residence. During the first Trump presidency, Beth Emmet joined a Evanston community effort to defend immigrants under the threat of deportation. What should our community do now? First, we must protect individual immigrant families facing deportation. Second, we should support the work of nonprofit organizations which are defending immigrants and challenging in the federal courts the unlawful actions of the Trump administration. Third, it's critical that we help organize and participate in mass protests against Trump's agenda for mass deportations. Mass protests can stop Trump from fully implementing his agenda. In 2018, through mass protests, the American people stopped Trump's child separation policy, which was separating thousands of children from their parents and putting the children in cages along the border. We need to convince our fellow Americans that mass deportation will destroy the mixed status families in which millions of U.S. citizens and legal immigrants live, and be disastrous for our economy, which depends on immigrant workers to plant and pick our crops, prepare our food, manufacture our products, and care for our homes, our children, our elderly, and our disabled. Fourth, we must participate in the defense of our political freedoms so that American voters are not prevented in 2026 from ousting members of Congress who are rubber stamping Trump's agenda and supporting his white supremacist policies. In particular, we need to volunteer in red and purple states to protect voters of color and motivate voters to reject Trump-supported candidates for Congress. Our religious foreparents who wrote the Torah wisely instructed us no less than 36 times to defend the strangers in our midst, because they understood that one of the most important measures of justice in a society is how its immigrants are treated, and that a society which mistreats its immigrants is ultimately a society in which the well-being of all, including that of Jews, is in danger. Thank you.